Some mistakes don't ruin your life. They reveal the life that was waiting for you all along. I never believed that until the night an entire ballroom forgot how to breathe because of me. The crystal chandeliers above reflected 1,000 golden lights across polished marble floors, turning every expensive smile into something almost unreal. I didn't belong there. My name was Claire Bennett. I was 26 years old, working the evening shift for an event staffing company while trying to save enough money to reopen the neighborhood bookstore my late grandmother had loved more than anything. My black uniform was perfectly pressed, but no amount of careful ironing could disguise the fact that I was the only person in the room counting every hour on the clock, instead of every dollar in their investment portfolio. Around me, senators laughed beside movie producers. CEOs toasted with old family dynasties, and women wearing diamonds larger than my monthly rent glided through conversations that sounded as rehearsed as the orchestra hidden behind velvet curtains. I balanced a silver tray filled with champagne flutes, reminding myself to smile, to keep moving, and to stay invisible. Invisible people finished their shifts without trouble. Invisible people collected their paychecks and went home. That was all I wanted. Then the room changed. I didn't hear an announcement. I felt it. Conversations slowed. Heads turned toward the grand staircase as 6 men in perfectly tailored black suits descended in complete silence. They weren't loud. They didn't have to be. The crowd instinctively stepped aside before they reached the ballroom floor. At the center of them walked a man whose presence seemed to pull the air from the room itself. Damian Moretti looked no older than 32, tall, composed, wearing a charcoal suit that fit as though it had been crafted one stitch at a time. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his blue eyes calm enough to hide whatever storm lived behind them. He acknowledged no one with unnecessary gestures. Powerful people approached him. He simply decided whether they deserved a nod. I lowered my eyes and continued toward the VIP table. Men like him belonged in newspaper headlines, not in the life of a woman who drove an 8-year-old Honda and worried about grocery prices. As I reached the table, another server hurried past me, accidentally brushing my shoulder. One champagne glass tipped. My tray shifted. I caught it before everything crashed, but one velvet ring box resting beside a floral centerpiece slid across the polished tablecloth. Instinct took over. Before it could fall, I reached for it at the exact same moment Damian extended his hand toward the box. Our movements collided. The lid flipped open. A platinum ring slipped free, caught the ballroom lights, and landed squarely in my palm. I froze. So did he. Without thinking, believing I was simply returning what belonged to him before it disappeared beneath the table, I stepped closer and gently lifted his hand. He looked directly into my eyes. For one impossible second, neither of us moved. Then his fingers closed around mine, steady and deliberate, and with the entire ballroom watching, he slid the ring onto my left hand. The silence that followed felt louder than thunder. A woman near the orchestra gasped. Someone dropped a wine glass across the room. Every guard standing behind Damian instinctively straightened, their expressions shifting from disciplined confidence to unmistakable disbelief. I stared at the ring now resting against my skin, unable to understand why no one was speaking. Then, one by one, the most powerful people in the ballroom lowered their heads toward me. I whispered the only words my mind could find. "I think you've made a mistake." Damian didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the ring, as though it had just rewritten both of our futures. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone heard it. "No," he said quietly. "The mistake happened long before tonight." The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt long enough for my entire life to split into before and after. Every pair of eyes in the ballroom remained fixed on the platinum ring, resting against my hand, as though it carried a meaning I could not possibly understand. I instinctively reached to remove it, embarrassed by what had obviously been an awkward misunderstanding. But before my fingers touched the polished band, one of the men standing behind Damian quietly cleared his throat. The sound was almost gentle, yet it froze everyone nearby. "Do not remove it," he said with careful respect, speaking to me instead of commanding me. I blinked in confusion. "I think you have the wrong person," I whispered. "I work here." No one answered immediately. Damien continued looking at me, with an expression that was impossible to read. He did not appear angry. He did not appear surprised anymore either. If anything, he looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly changed shape. Around us, the orchestra had stopped playing altogether. Conversations remained suspended in uneasy silence until an older gentleman, wearing an elegant tuxedo, slowly approached Damien. His silver hair and composed posture suggested decades of authority, yet even he lowered his voice before speaking. "Mr. Moretti," he said carefully, "the ceremony cannot simply continue as though nothing happened." Ceremony. The word echoed inside my head. I looked around and finally noticed the elaborate arrangement of white roses near the stage, the family crest embroidered into the velvet backdrop, and several photographers standing completely motionless, their cameras lowered as though they no longer knew what they were supposed to capture. This had not been an ordinary charity gala. Something important had been planned here tonight. Something I had unknowingly interrupted. "Please," I said, my voice shaking despite my effort to stay calm. "Someone explain what is happening." The older man glanced toward Damien before answering. "Miss, that ring represents a public promise recognized by every family in attendance. Once it is placed willingly before witnesses, tradition does not allow it to be reclaimed." I laughed softly, almost out of disbelief. Tradition? This was an accident. My words sounded reasonable to me. They sounded completely useless to everyone else. Damien finally stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear him. "I know it was." His calm tone somehow unsettled me more than panic would have. "Then tell them. It is no longer that simple." Before I could respond, another voice interrupted from across the ballroom. "Absolutely not." A tall woman in an elegant emerald gown strode toward us with flawless confidence. Her blonde hair framed a face that belonged on magazine covers, but the disappointment in her eyes was impossible to hide. She stopped several feet away from Damien without looking at me. "Tell them this means nothing," she demanded quietly. "Tell them she is a server who happened to be standing in the wrong place." Damien did not answer. The woman slowly turned toward me. For a brief moment, I expected anger, but instead, I saw something closer to heartbreak. "What is your name?" she asked. "Claire Bennett." She nodded once, almost sadly. "Claire, you have no idea what that ring has just made you." Before I could ask what she meant, another guest hurried toward Damien and whispered something into his ear. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. He looked toward the ballroom entrance where more security personnel had quietly appeared, speaking into earpieces while discreetly guiding guests away from the exits. My heartbeat quickened. "Why are they closing the doors?" I asked. Damien met my eyes again. "Because," he said with complete honesty, "the moment that ring touched your hand, everyone in this room began making plans. Some will want to protect you, others will want to use you, and a few will do everything they can to convince the world that tonight never happened. Until I know which is which, you are safest beside me." My legs refused to move even after everyone else seemed to know exactly what needed to happen. I looked toward the ballroom entrance, hoping someone from the event staff would recognize me, laugh awkwardly, and explain that the entire evening had somehow become an elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, my supervisor lowered her eyes the moment we made eye contact. She gave me the smallest shake of her head before quietly disappearing behind a curtain with the rest of the catering team. I was suddenly standing alone in a room filled with strangers who all seemed to believe my life had changed forever. Damien extended his hand toward me, not forcefully, not impatiently, simply waiting. "Claire," he said calmly, "we cannot solve this standing in front of 300 witnesses." I folded my arms instinctively. "I am not going anywhere with you." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, although there was no amusement behind it. "That is a reasonable answer." He glanced toward the guests gathering in small circles, whispering behind raised glasses. "Unfortunately, reasonable answers have become very expensive tonight." I followed his gaze. Every conversation stopped whenever I looked in that direction. Some faces showed curiosity. Others measured me as though they were trying to calculate my value. It was the first time in my life that complete strangers looked at me as though they already knew my future. The woman in the emerald gown, whose quiet disappointment still lingered in my thoughts, approached once more. This time her expression had softened. "My name is Victoria Ashford," she said. "You have every right to be frightened. Then help me leave." Her eyes briefly met Damien's before returning to mine. "If leaving were still possible, I would be the first person to open that door for you." Those words settled heavily inside my chest. I wanted someone to tell me this was all ridiculous. Instead, every answer made the situation feel even more real. Damien removed his suit jacket and draped it carefully over the back of a nearby chair before loosening his tie slightly. The simple gesture surprised me. Until now, he had looked almost untouchable, every movement controlled with perfect precision. For the first time, he seemed tired. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me much more than that," I replied before I could stop myself. To my surprise, he nodded. "You are right." One of his advisors stepped closer and quietly handed him a tablet. Damien studied the screen for only a few seconds before locking it again. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We should leave now." "Why?" I asked. "Because news travels faster than truth." He looked directly into my eyes. "Someone has already leaked photographs of the ring." My stomach dropped. "That is impossible. It happened 5 minutes ago." 5 minutes is a very long time for people with enough influence. Another guest hurried past us while pretending not to look. His phone remained raised at chest level, the camera pointed in our direction. Damien noticed it instantly. Without raising his voice, he simply nodded toward one of his security officers. The officer approached the guest politely, spoke quietly, and the phone disappeared into the man's pocket without another word. No shouting, no confrontation, just quiet authority that everyone immediately respected. I had never seen anything like it. Outside the ballroom windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the evening sky, thousands of lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere beyond those buildings was my tiny apartment, my unfinished cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, my stack of overdue bookstore renovation plans, and the ordinary life that already felt impossibly distant. Damien held the ballroom door open instead of walking through it first. "You still have a choice," he said. "You may walk beside me willingly, or I can spend the next several hours convincing every person here that you deserve complete freedom. I promise you, I will try. I simply do not know if I will succeed." His honesty caught me completely off guard. Powerful men were supposed to sound certain. Damien sounded burdened. I looked once more at the unfamiliar platinum ring resting on my finger. Then I looked back at the crowd, studying every movement we made. Whatever had begun tonight was already larger than either of us. Taking one slow breath, I stepped through the doorway beside him, unaware that somewhere beyond the hotel walls, someone watching the first published photograph of my hand was quietly smiling, as though this impossible mistake had unfolded exactly according to plan. The drive across Manhattan passed in complete silence, but my thoughts were louder than the city outside the window. Through the tinted glass, I watched familiar streets disappear behind us, one block at a time, wondering how a normal evening had transformed into something that no longer felt connected to my real life. Damien sat across from me inside the spacious SUV, reading messages that continued arriving every few seconds. He barely acknowledged them before locking the screen again. Whatever those updates contained, they seemed to make the lines around his eyes grow sharper with every passing minute. Finally, I could not bear the silence any longer. "You keep saying this is complicated," I said quietly. "Then stop protecting me from the truth, and tell me exactly what that ring means." He looked up immediately, as though he had been expecting the question from the moment we left the hotel. "It is older than I am," he answered. "Older than my father as well. Every generation of my family has passed it to the next leader." I frowned. "It is an heirloom. It is much more than that." He paused before continuing. "Publicly placing that ring on someone creates a promise that every influential family connected to ours has recognized for decades. Business agreements, charitable foundations, private investments, family alliances, even international partnerships are built around the belief that whoever wears it stands beside the head of the Moretti family." I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. "You are saying people believe I suddenly belong in that world because of one mistake?" They believe the choice was intentional. Then tell them it was not. Damien looked toward the city lights beyond the window before answering. Some traditions survive because people believe in them more than facts. His words unsettled me because they sounded painfully sincere. We drove through a pair of iron gates that opened without a sound. Beyond them stood an estate that looked less like a private residence and more like a historic museum, surrounded by perfectly trimmed gardens. Warm lights glowed behind tall windows, giving the enormous stone building an almost peaceful appearance, despite everything I had experienced that evening. As soon as the vehicle stopped, an elderly woman stepped onto the front staircase before anyone could open the doors. She wore a navy blue dress with a cream shawl folded neatly across her shoulders, and there was something reassuring about her gentle smile. "Welcome home, Mr. Moretti," she said, before her eyes shifted toward me. Instead of surprise, she offered a warm expression that reminded me of my grandmother. "And welcome, Miss Bennett." I blinked. "You already know my name?" She smiled kindly. "Everyone in this house does." Damien noticed the discomfort on my face. "This is Evelyn. She has cared for my family since before I was born." Evelyn stepped closer and gently touched my hand. Not the ring itself, but the fingers beside it. "You must be exhausted." I nodded before I could stop myself. Somehow her kindness made the evening feel even more overwhelming. Inside the mansion, polished wood floors reflected soft amber light from antique lamps. Family portraits lined the walls, each one watching us as though carrying silent expectations from another century. Damien led me into a quiet library filled with leather-bound books and a fire that crackled gently despite the mild autumn evening. He opened a small wooden case resting inside a glass cabinet. There, nestled on dark velvet, was an old black-and-white photograph. A young woman smiled beside a man wearing a suit remarkably similar to Damien's. On her hand rested the very same platinum ring. "Every woman who ever wore it changed the future of this family," Damien said softly. "Some through love, some through sacrifice, none by accident." I looked from the photograph to the ring on my own finger, a chill running through me despite the warmth of the room. Before I could ask another question, Damien's phone vibrated once. He answered, listened without speaking, then slowly lowered the device. His expression had become colder than I had seen all night. "What happened?" I asked. He met my eyes with quiet concern. "Someone has released another photograph." I frowned. "Another one from the ballroom?" He shook his head once. "No, this one was taken inside this house less than 30 seconds ago. Which means whoever planned tonight is already closer to us than I ever imagined." Sleep never came that night. Evelyn had shown me to a beautiful guest room overlooking the gardens, but every elegant detail only reminded me how impossible it was that I was there at all. My phone rested on the bedside table, flooded with missed calls from coworkers, messages from friends asking why my photograph was suddenly appearing on social media beside one of the most influential businessmen in New York, and dozens of unknown numbers that I refused to answer. I finally switched the phone off, hoping silence would somehow return my ordinary life. It did not. Just after sunrise, a soft knock came at the door. Evelyn entered carrying a breakfast tray that looked far too elaborate for someone who had barely eaten since lunchtime the day before. Fresh fruit, coffee, warm pastries, and a handwritten note rested beside the plate. I unfolded it carefully. "Please eat before we talk. It will be a long morning. Damien." I smiled despite myself. It was the first thoughtful thing anyone had done for me since this unbelievable chain of events had begun. A few minutes later, Damien was waiting in the library exactly where I had left him the night before. He had exchanged his formal suit for a navy sweater and pressed slacks, looking less like an untouchable public figure and more like an ordinary man carrying an extraordinary burden. He stood as I entered. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Not even a little." He nodded knowingly. Neither did I. Before either of us could continue, another man entered, carrying a folder thick with printed documents. He introduced himself as Oliver Grant, the family's legal advisor, then placed the folder on the table between us. "You should both see this." Damien opened the first page. Newspaper websites, financial blogs, entertainment outlets, and business journals all displayed nearly identical headlines. None of them questioned whether the engagement was real. Every article treated it as an established fact. Some praised the mysterious woman who had suddenly appeared beside Damien Moretti. Others speculated about secret alliances, hidden inheritances, or carefully planned negotiations. I felt my stomach tighten with every page. "This is insane," I whispered. "Nobody even knows me." Oliver looked at me sympathetically. "That is exactly why they are inventing stories." Damien slowly closed the folder. "Find the original source." Oliver hesitated. "We already tried." "And?" "Every article traces back to the same anonymous account that uploaded the ballroom photographs before anyone officially left the event." Damien frowned. "The same account that somehow photographed Claire inside this house?" Oliver nodded once. "Yes." The room became very quiet. I finally asked the question that had been growing in my mind since the drive from the hotel. If someone planned this, why me? Damien answered honestly, "I do not know." Surely there were hundreds of women at that gala. Exactly. He leaned forward, resting his hands together. "Which means choosing you required preparation." The thought sent a chill through me. I had spent years believing I was invisible, just another hard-working woman, trying to build a simple future. The possibility that someone had noticed me long before I ever noticed them felt deeply unsettling. Evelyn quietly entered with fresh coffee, but paused when she sensed the tension. She looked toward Damien with gentle concern. "There is another visitor." Damien checked his watch. "I was not expecting anyone." Evelyn lowered her voice. "Neither were we." Moments later, the front doors opened, and Victoria Ashford stepped into the library. She no longer wore the glamorous emerald gown from the gala. Instead, she looked exhausted, as though she had not slept either. She looked directly at me before speaking. "Claire, I came because there is something you deserve to know." Damien immediately stood. "Victoria, this is not the time." She ignored him completely. Her eyes never left mine. "Before last night, I spent 3 months investigating a series of anonymous messages, warning me that the engagement ceremony would never happen as planned." My heartbeat quickened. "Anonymous messages?" Victoria slowly reached into her handbag and removed a plain white envelope. I thought they were ridiculous until now. She placed several printed photographs onto the table. Every one of them showed me. Walking into my neighborhood grocery store, unlocking my old Honda, carrying boxes out of my grandmother's bookstore. They had all been taken weeks before the gala, and someone had been watching me long before I ever met Damien. For the first time since the gala, I felt genuinely afraid, not because of the ring or the headlines, but because someone had quietly stepped through my ordinary life, without my ever noticing. I picked up one of the photographs with trembling hands. It showed me unlocking the front door of my grandmother's bookstore on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Another captured me carrying coffee across the street to an elderly neighbor. A third showed me sitting alone in the park, reading renovation estimates that I could barely afford. None of the photographs invaded my personal space, yet every one of them stole something precious. They proved that a stranger had been watching me live a life I believed belonged only to me. "Who took these?" I whispered. Victoria slowly shook her head. The envelopes never contained a name, only warnings. Damien studied each photograph carefully before placing them back on the table. His expression remained calm, but I noticed his fingers tighten slightly against the folder. "Oliver," he said quietly, "I want every security recording from the bookstore, the neighborhood, and every surrounding block from the past 3 months." Oliver nodded immediately. "Already requested." Damien looked at him. "Not requested. Personally reviewed." Oliver understood the difference without another explanation, and quietly left the room. I looked at Damien in disbelief. "You really think someone planned all of this months ago?" He met my eyes without hesitation. "I no longer think anything else makes sense." The certainty in his voice should have frightened me. Instead, it gave me something I had not felt since the ballroom. Someone believed me. Someone else finally understood that I had not chosen this. Evelyn gently placed another cup of coffee in front of me, before resting one comforting hand on my shoulder. "You are safe here." I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But safety felt impossible after seeing those photographs. "My apartment," I suddenly said. "My bookstore." Damien immediately understood. You are worried someone may still be watching those places. I nodded. My neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, lives alone. She checks on the bookstore whenever I work late. What if someone follows her because of me? Damien stood without another word. We are leaving. I looked up in surprise. Where? Wherever your life existed before last night. Victoria frowned. Damien, that is exactly what whoever planned this will expect. Perhaps, he answered calmly. But Claire deserves to know whether her world is still her own. Less than 20 minutes later, we drove through familiar streets in 2 ordinary vehicles, instead of the luxury convoy I had expected. Damien insisted that fewer people would notice us that way. He wore a simple dark jacket and baseball cap that made him almost unrecognizable. I almost smiled at the thought that one of the city's most influential men was trying to blend into an ordinary neighborhood. When we reached the bookstore, my heart sank. The windows were intact. The front door was locked exactly as I had left it. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Maybe I imagined the worst, I whispered hopefully. Damien remained silent. He slowly walked across the sidewalk, then crouched beside a flower planter near the entrance. Claire. His voice was calm, but something in it made me stop breathing. I hurried toward him. Resting beneath the planter was a small white envelope, sealed with dark blue wax. My name was written across the front in elegant handwriting. I stared at it, certain I had never seen it before. Damien carefully picked it up without breaking the seal. This was left recently, he said. How can you tell? He pointed toward the flower bed beneath it. The soil was still slightly disturbed, untouched by the light rain that had fallen before sunrise. Someone had placed it there only a short time ago. My pulse raced as Damien handed me the envelope. It is addressed to you. My fingers trembled as I slowly opened it. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. It read, "The ring found exactly the woman it was always meant to find." Beneath those words rested an old, faded photograph of a smiling young woman standing beside my grandmother nearly 30 years earlier. The faded photograph refused to leave my hands. I stared at the smiling faces until the edges blurred, trying to understand how my grandmother could have known someone connected to Damien's family without ever mentioning it. She had told me countless stories while we dusted old bookshelves together. Stories about courage, kindness, and never allowing money to define a person's worth. She had never once mentioned powerful families, secret traditions, or a platinum ring that could change someone's future overnight. Who is she? I asked quietly, pointing to the young woman standing beside my grandmother. Damien studied the picture for several long seconds before answering. I do not know. That surprised me. I had expected immediate recognition. Instead, he looked as puzzled as I felt. Victoria gently leaned closer. Turn it over. I carefully flipped the photograph in my hands. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were only 2 words and a date. Always believe. October 14th, 1996. My heart skipped. October 14th was my birthday. Not the year, but the day. I looked at Damien. This cannot be a coincidence anymore. He slowly nodded. No, it cannot. We returned to the bookstore and locked the front door behind us. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning sunlight, illuminating shelves that still waited for the renovation my grandmother and I had dreamed about for years. Everything smelled exactly as I remembered. Old paper, cedar wood, fresh coffee lingering from the cafe next door. For the first time since the gala, I felt grounded by something familiar. Damien quietly wandered through the aisles without touching anything. He paused in front of an old reading corner, where my grandmother used to host story time for neighborhood children every Saturday morning. A framed photograph rested on a nearby shelf. He picked it up carefully. Claire. I walked over. The picture showed my grandmother standing outside the bookstore 20 years earlier, surrounded by smiling children holding donated books. Behind them, barely visible through the reflection in the window, stood a young man wearing a baseball cap. Most people would never have noticed him. Damien did. Can you enlarge this? He asked, handing the frame to Oliver, who had quietly arrived a few minutes earlier, carrying a portable scanner from the car. Oliver digitized the photograph within moments and enlarged the background. My breath caught. The young man was looking directly toward my grandmother, not the children. His face remained partly hidden beneath the cap, but one detail stood out immediately. A distinctive signet ring rested on his right hand. Damien's expression changed. That ring belonged to my father. Silence settled over the room. "Your father was here?" I asked. "Apparently." He continued studying the image with growing disbelief. "This photograph was taken years before I inherited the family responsibilities." Victoria folded her arms thoughtfully. "Then someone connected your family to Claire's long before either of you knew each other." I slowly walked toward the old wooden desk, where my grandmother had always kept customer receipts and handwritten letters. Most drawers contained nothing except faded stationery and dried fountain pens. But the bottom drawer resisted when I tried to open it. After several attempts, it finally slid forward with a soft scrape. Inside rested a small leather journal wrapped carefully in cream-colored cloth. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon. The first page contained my grandmother's handwriting. Beneath it was a sentence that stole the air from my lungs. "If Claire ever reads this, it means the promise I made 30 years ago has finally come due." I looked up in complete disbelief. Damien had gone perfectly still. Evelyn, who had quietly entered carrying tea for everyone, nearly dropped the tray before catching herself. None of us spoke. The room had become so silent that I could hear the old grandfather clock in the corner counting each passing second. I turned the page, expecting answers at last. Instead, I found that nearly every page of the journal had been carefully removed, leaving only the final sheet untouched. Across the center, written in the same familiar handwriting, were 8 simple words that changed everything once again. "Trust Damien. Doubt everyone else, even those beside him." The words on the final page echoed through my mind long after I closed the journal. Trust Damien. Doubt everyone else, even those beside him. I read them again, hoping they would somehow change, but the faded ink remained exactly the same. My grandmother had never wasted words. Every sentence she wrote carried purpose. If she had chosen to leave only that message behind, she must have believed I would need it more than any explanation. I slowly looked around the bookstore. Oliver was examining the empty journal with professional curiosity. Victoria stood near the front window, watching the quiet street outside. Evelyn carefully folded the cream-colored cloth that had protected the journal for decades. Damien remained exactly where he had been since reading the message, his attention fixed on the missing pages rather than the words that remained. Something about that realization stayed with me. He was not trying to convince me to trust him. He was trying to understand who had erased the truth before I could find it. "Do you know who removed the pages?" I asked softly. Damien answered without looking up. "No, but whoever did it wanted you to find the journal exactly like this." Oliver carefully inspected the torn binding with a magnifying lens from his briefcase. "These pages were not removed recently. The paper has aged evenly. It happened years ago." Victoria turned away from the window. "Which means someone planned for Claire to discover an incomplete story." I rested my hand on the old wooden desk where my grandmother had spent countless afternoons, balancing receipts and recommending novels to customers. Suddenly, I remembered something she used to say whenever I became frustrated as a child. "The answer is never in the place everyone is looking." At the time, I thought she was talking about missing library books. Now I wondered if she had been teaching me something much larger. I looked beneath the desk, inside the shelves, behind framed photographs, searching with fresh determination. Most of what I found were ordinary memories: birthday cards, book club schedules, old postcards from loyal customers. Then my fingers brushed against something hidden beneath the underside of the desk. A small brass key had been carefully taped where no customer would ever notice it. I found something. Everyone gathered around as I held up the tiny key. It carried no label, only the engraved initials H and B, intertwined inside a small circle. "What does that stand for?" I asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Helen Bennett. Your grandmother had custom keys made many years ago." I searched the room until my eyes settled on an antique glass display cabinet that had always remained locked. As a child, I had asked dozens of times what was inside, and my grandmother always answered with the same smile. One day, when the time is right, my hands shook as I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned smoothly. The cabinet opened with a gentle click. Inside sat a simple wooden music box, its polished surface worn from years of careful handling. There were no jewels, no money, no secret documents, just the music box. I lifted the lid. Instead of music, a folded letter rested inside. The envelope bore my name in my grandmother's handwriting. Before I could open it, Damien's phone vibrated sharply. He answered immediately, listening without interrupting. His expression became unreadable. When the call ended, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked directly at Oliver. The anonymous account uploaded another message. Oliver frowned. What does it say? Damien did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted toward the unopened envelope in my hands. It says Claire must never read the letter inside that music box. A cold silence settled over the bookstore. Whoever had been watching us did not merely know where we were. They knew exactly what I had found within seconds of the cabinet opening. I slowly looked around the familiar room that had always felt like the safest place in my life. For the first time, it no longer felt empty. It felt as though unseen eyes had been waiting here long before I ever walked back through the front door. My hands remained wrapped around the unopened envelope, while the entire bookstore fell silent. Whoever had been following this story knew exactly what was hidden inside before I did. That realization changed something inside me. Until now, I had been reacting to every twist, every message, every impossible coincidence. For the first time, I decided I would make the next choice myself. I looked directly at Damien. If someone wants me to be afraid of this letter, then it probably contains the truth. He held my gaze for several seconds before giving a single quiet nod. I agree. Victoria stepped closer. Then read it. I carefully broke the old wax seal, unfolded the yellowed paper, and immediately recognized my grandmother's graceful handwriting. My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then destiny has finally reached you. You were never chosen because of a mistake. Long before you were born, I made a promise with a man who believed that power should protect kindness instead of controlling it. His name was Anthony Moretti. Damien slowly closed his eyes. My father, he whispered. I continued reading. Anthony once told me that one generation cannot always repair the mistakes of the one before it, but perhaps the next generation can. We promised that if life ever placed our families together again, the decision would belong to the children, not to us. No arrangement, no pressure, only choice. Tears blurred the ink as I reached the final lines. If you have met Damien, remember this, above everything else. Judge him by the way he treats people who cannot offer him anything in return. That will tell you who he truly is. I lowered the letter without speaking. Everything suddenly felt different. My grandmother had not been preparing me to enter a powerful family. She had been protecting my freedom to choose for myself. Damien quietly walked toward the old reading corner, where children had once gathered around my grandmother every Saturday morning. My father disappeared for hours every month, he said softly. I never knew where he went. He always returned carrying a paper bag filled with old books. He told me they came from a woman who believed every child deserved a story to call their own. His voice became quieter. That woman was your grandmother. I smiled through tears that I had stopped trying to hide. Two ordinary people had quietly built a friendship that neither wealth nor influence had erased. Suddenly, Oliver's phone chimed. He studied the screen before looking up with visible surprise. The anonymous account has disappeared. Deleted? Victoria asked. Oliver nodded. Every photograph, every message, every post, gone. Damien looked toward me instead of the phone. Then, whoever started this has what they wanted. I glanced at the platinum ring resting on my hand. Only a few days earlier, I had believed it represented a prison built by someone else's decision. Now I understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me my entire life. A promise only has meaning when it is accepted freely. I slowly slipped the ring from my finger and placed it into Damien's open hand. His expression remained calm, though I could see the quiet disappointment he tried to hide. You were right, I said gently. The first time this ring was placed on my hand, it happened by accident. I stepped one pace closer and gently closed his fingers around it. If it ever returns, it should never be because of tradition, pressure, or somebody else's plan. Damien looked at me for a long moment, before offering the smallest genuine smile I had seen since the night we met. He opened his hand once more. Then let the next choice belong only to us. Without another word, I took the ring from his palm and placed it back onto my own finger. This time, there were no witnesses waiting to applaud, no cameras recording history, and no ancient customs demanding obedience. There were only two people choosing trust over fear, and as sunlight poured through the bookstore windows onto shelves filled with stories about hope, I finally understood that destiny had never been hidden inside a ring. It had always been waiting inside the courage to choose each other.